SEL, and Amina has changed trade facilitation.
Well, good morning and welcome everybody to the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Jane Harmon, our president and CEO, who's out on the West Coast today, so I get the honor of being with you. On behalf of Dr. Monde Muyangwa, director of our Africa program. This promises to be a very exciting morning. I know some of our colleagues will be joining us shortly. For those of you that went through traffic this morning or through the metro, you know how bad it is out there today. For some reason, I'm a Washingtonian. I'm a native Washingtonian, so I can say this. We are terrible drivers, by the way, when it rains in this city. It's even worse when it snows, but it's terrible when it rains. But we will make it up for you with a fantastic program this morning. We are delighted to have with us the African Union, our colleagues from Manchester Trade, and we will be joined shortly by the chairman of the International Relations Committee, Chairman Royce as well. We have a fantastic lineup shortly. For those of you unfamiliar with the Wilson Center, it was established in 1968 by an act of Congress. We work to bridge the world of ideas with the world of policy, the world of ideas with the world of action. We provide a trusted political space where the worlds of policy and scholarship interact. And we are particularly committed to global issues, and have a particular commitment to Africa and Africa-US relations through our Africa program led by Monde. Today's conversation comes at an incredibly timely point in Africa and in Africa-US relations. Africa is transforming rapidly, economically, politically, and socially. Under the leadership of Chairperson Zuma, who will join us shortly, the African Union has worked hard on these issues. On the economic front, many African economies continue to expand at a rapid pace, with growth at 4.5% in 2014 and projected to rise up to 5.1% in 2015. And this is at a time where growth in other parts of the world is actually very slow. So Africa really shines in difference to other parts of the world in terms of its economic growth. This economic growth is taking place within the framework in which the African Union, under the leadership of Chairperson Dlamini Zuma, has taken the lead to work with member states and ordinary Africans to articulate a vision for the Africa they would like to see by 2063, also known as Agenda 2063. Our discussion today centers on Agenda 2063 and what it will take to get there, and how the United States and Africa could develop more effective partnerships in a variety of spheres, but especially those aimed at facilitating trade, spurring growth and development, while garnering mutual benefits for Africa and the United States in order to realize this vision. Chairperson Dlamini Zuma and Congressman Ed Royce will join us later in the program, as I already mentioned. To lead us through these discussions, let me now turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Dennis Matanda, Head of Government Relations at Manchester Trade, who is going to lead this panel discussion. Thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you so much. I have so many things to say, and this is almost my third time to work with Monde. Monde, thank you so much for having us here today. And I also need to say a great thank you to Elizabeth and Grace. Elizabeth and Grace and Monde have been fantastic in getting the African Union here today. So just a little correction. Today, I'm an African Union consultant, which is, I'm not saying the African Union is here, because the African Union is stuck in traffic. And it's not just one person. There's so many reserved seats here where people are supposed to be here on time, but throw a little rain into Washington, D.C., and then everybody gets into a mess. I mean, I wish this was Boston. They understand the essence of weather. My name is Dennis Matanda, and I'm from Uganda. I'm very fortunate that my last name is Matanda, so I could be from Monde's country, I could be from your country, I could be from Kenya, I could be from Tanzania, and somehow, somewhere, I escape and I get away with so much. One of the things that I'm very fortunate to have is some really, really good friends. A few days ago in Addis Ababa, I was at an event, and Florie Lizea, who is our Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Africa, walked in, and she had this great presentation. And then I met the Director of Trade, Industry and Taxes at COMESA, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. And he says to me, "Oh, Dennis, has Dominic come?" So I say, "Oh, I think he's here. He's at the Sheraton." And he says, "Oh, I have to tell you a story about Dominic." Ladies and gentlemen, Dominic Njinku might be a World Bank trade facilitation expert, but he is an activist first and foremost. He has walked into a few important meetings and he has actually taken over, even if he wasn't invited. Dominic, you have been invited for this event. And like you promised outside, there's no lecturing today. We can only talk about the things you care about, which is trade facilitation. And of course, the relationship between the United States, Africa, and the rest of the world. Still talking about friends. I think there's somebody here who loves my children more than me. Stephen Landy is my boss and my friend. He calls me every single day. Actually, he calls me about twice a day to talk about other things. But he always asks, how are your children? And I keep telling him, do you like my children more than me? Do you realize that you're a Jewish man and these are my children? And he says, you do realize they are my children as well, because he has seen them more often in the past 5-6 months that they have been born. My boss, my friend, Stephen Landy, is also an expert on the US-Africa trade and investment relationship. Steve Landy is supposedly the father of the generalized system of preferences, and the two of them are actually really good friends. I'm hoping that we can yak it up, and I told him if I think that they're saying something complicated, I'm going to stop them, because I think that although some of us are experts in our fields, it's very important for us to progress the relationship between the United States and Africa more than technical elements. That is the preference. Let me just talk about the very last person that's going to be on this panel. So when he gets here, I'm hoping that we'll do musical chairs and give the deputy chairperson of the African Union his actual spot. Honorable Mwencha is a believer. Again, when he gets here, hopefully we can actually accord him not the respect, let's just give him a round of applause for making it through the traffic. That way, he will realize that we have actually been waiting for him. Honorable Mwencha is an activist, very much like Dominic. He's a believer, very much like Stephen. And what he wants, and if you listen to him speak, he always says, I don't want to talk about AGOA. I don't want to talk about trade facilitation. I don't want to talk about any of these things. I just want to talk about the dynamic that exists between the foremost consumer economy in the world, and Africa. Africa is not just one of the fastest growing. Africa is aggressive. You will hear things like what do they call it? The demographic dynamic or something because what do they call it? The demographic dividend. Something about young people driving the next generation. So I just wanted to give a bit of a background to almost provide context and to also express my profound humility to be on a panel of my friends. Dominic, I just want to start with you. You have a few minutes to talk about the overall essence of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the overall essence of trade facilitation, and also something that we are both very passionate about, Bali 2013 and the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, Dominic Njinku, Stephen Landy. If we could give him a round of applause. Gentlemen, you're welcome.
Thank you, Dennis, and good morning, everybody. In 5 to 7 minutes, let me try to see what I can say. The last time I spoke at the Wilson Center, I was launching a book that I work on in the context of aid for trade, which is something I will come to later on. The first message I would want to pass on to you and maybe for our discussion is if I compare Africa Trade Agenda of 2015 to the Africa Trade Agenda that I started working intensively on in 1999, a lot has changed. In 1999, we were really struggling with what to do with Seattle. We were thinking about putting development in the WTO. And those of us who believe that trade is an engine of growth, we understood at the time that we do need very good trade rules. That's why we were supporting, pushing the trade agenda. But we were also pushing for getting the capacity to produce and to trade. Today in Africa, we do have the discussion about a continental free trade agreement. We are talking about Agenda 2063. And some of you might say, have we not heard of this before? I would say yes and no. The yes is basically that as Africa is hoping by 2063 to get a prosperous Africa of Africans, dream was there in 1963. We tried in Lagos Plan of Action, we tried in Nepal. We didn't get there really. But again, when I compare 1999 or 2000 to today, the discussion on trade issue in Africa is well informed. The academics are talking properly about the trade agenda. The civil society, when there is a disagreement amongst the stakeholders, it is increasingly being informed. We have now an African Union Commission, which is different from the Organization of African Unity, which is really mobilizing both the public and private sector and the civil society for a good trade agenda. That means, although it can look like Lagos Plan of Action and so on, the way it's been negotiated, the empowerment that we have in the African stakeholder communities make it that we might get a different outcome by 2063, given the way we are proceeding. Of course, to get to 2063, we need to get to 2023. So basically then, and again, I was in Addis Ababa 2 weeks ago, where we were discussing about the needs for the 10 first years of Agenda 2063 to really realize that Africa dream. And again, when we came out of it, is first to recognize basically what is already being done. Whether the tripartite process in Eastern and Southern Africa, whether it's the common external tariff and in West Africa, when you look, then basically the ingredients for a successful first 10 years of Agenda 2063 are there. We just need to mobilize ourselves in doing so. Of course, the African Union is doing its own, and the United Economic Commission for Africa, they are doing a good job. But what I would want to put for our discussion here is basically that it's primarily really looking at the process of getting the continental free trade effective. What we really do need to get the things going is to make sure then that we work with the regional economic communities to make sure then that their trade regime are properly liberalized between themselves. It's pro-growth, pro-jobs, pro-development. In doing so, one thing we also need to do, and which is also a point I would want us to put on the table, is basically the risk of orphans. That means basically we might easily coalesce around a certain group of countries that are doing well to show results. But the risk that I see in the Continental Free Trade Agreement is the possibility that some of the region are left behind, and then if several regions are left, several countries are left behind, or some regions are left behind, it might be difficult to get that aspiration. The second element I would put here is that although I said, and that's true, on average, people know what they are talking about and have a proper discussion, I still think that we have not had it right in terms of mobilizing the private sector the same way that we have the public sector around the trade agenda. I'm talking here about mobilizing the domestic private sector, but also mobilizing the international private sector. Okay, that's one point I I would want to highlight. Since I still have about just 2 minutes, let me touch on, since Dennis asked about the trade facilitation agreement that we had in Bali. As I was saying, the last time I spoke at the Wilson Center, I was launching a book called Aid for Trade and Development. Because basically, which came out of the fact that while we do need to have proper trade rules to support African development, we really need to pay proper attention to supply side, capacity constraint, and so on. And it was realized, looking at all the studies that have been done, that the trade cost agenda is a major impediment to African competitiveness, whether trading intra-regionally or trading internationally. That's why basically then internationally, the trade facilitation was identified as one area that could be front-loaded in the WTO negotiation. Africa, we did our part in as activists to promote it. But that said, okay, then it's really since December 2013 that the Bali agreement was reached, was finalized. We then need to get into the implementation. Again, back in Addis Ababa, it was good to know that so many donors are already mobilizing themselves, and including the USA. Thank you for that. To really work with the continental level, but also working at the sub-regional level to make sure that the agreement is implemented. But with that, I do have one concern, that the trade facilitation in the WTO were really only about 3 articles of GATT. It wasn't even about all the articles of GATT that pertain to trade facilitation.
You mean the general agreement?
The general agreement for tariffs
and trade.
Okay, so basically, it's just a minute part of the trade cost and trade facilitation that is needed for the continental free trade agreement to succeed. The risk that we are facing is the possibility that everybody, again, after Hong Kong, everybody was talking about aid for trade. Then after all the publicity, we then start getting into monitoring aid for trade and less into providing aid for trade. Of course, I should recognize what everybody else has been doing. Okay, so but what I'm then saying is that the trade facilitation agreement, as agreed by at the WTO, is just a small part of the trade facilitation concern of Africa. While we are pushing money into the trade facilitation agreement, the priority of Africa is the boosting intra-African trade. It is the entire panel of trade facilitation issues that need to be taken into account. So my plea, and I really want us to exchange on that, is how do we prevent the hype about implementing the Bali not to overshadow the implementation of the boosting intra-African trade, not to overshadow the overall trade and development which is behind the boosting intra-African trade. Because if we do that, in the next 2 years and so, we will declare that we have successfully implemented the Bali Agreement. Africa has successfully implemented the Bali Agreement, but our people will still not be able to define what trade facilitation is. They will still be unable to define what Bali is, and so on. So if we are to do that, we really need to then take that holistic view of trade facilitation, trade and development, such as to really address the key concern of trade and development for Africa.
What's interesting, Dominic, is that people in Africa don't care about the actual words trade facilitation. They just want to do business across borders. The people who are selling fish in Uganda and Rwanda want to be able to take their fish all the way to Kinshasa. And if there is a blockage between the two countries, we are not necessarily sitting in these rooms doing our jobs, so to speak. But I want to move away just from that issue to something that I've had very many people talk about this, but how the overall trade facilitation aspects and the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, mesh very well. Stephen, I'd like you to just start the process of your AGOA discussion by talking about the regional integration, the aspects around how AGOA could be a way that Africa's regional integration can actually move to the next level, and also talk about what's happening in Congress today.
Let me respond to your questions, but in the opposite direction. Let me talk fairly quickly about why. I don't know how Monday does it, but she reschedules things that are so timely and so important. But according to the latest I have heard, is that AGOA itself should be, at least the staff draft of AGOA should be ready and issued. Some people say the end of next week. Some people say the beginning of next week. It could even be tomorrow or the next day. But we really are on the verge of something happening extremely good and positive with AGOA, and almost everyone in this audience has worked to bring this about. Let me go real quickly again, because 7 minutes doesn't go fast. It goes very quickly when you want to make some points.
Yeah, Dominic spoke for 10.
And, oh, we got 3 more minutes. Thank you.
Then he has 3 more.
No, he has 4 more.
But you know, New York, you can very quickly. No, but seriously, but you can go and you can just run through quickly. The fact that AGOA is being passed, is unbelievable, and it does represent a lot of work by a lot of people. Sorry. Oh, okay. Does represent a lot of work by a lot of people, and so on. I thought AGOA was dead, actually. I was very nervous, because when the Africans signed, and had no choice but to sign, the economic partnership agreements with Europe, that became a, quote, reciprocal program, which meant that before any extension of AGOA would expire, the U.S. preferences would be put, the U.S. products would be put on a negative relationship to European exports. And I said, oh, God, we'll never do a non-reciprocal program. I must say the ambassador group was beautiful. They moved quickly. They took 2 basic positions that carried through the very day. Number one, AGOA is our responsibility to make it work. We need action plans. We have to work more on it and so on. We need more time. And that kind of changed the debate from, is the U.S. giving something to Africa, or is Africa going to take advantage of what it was given? And then the Africans said, Ethiopian ambassador, but very smart, is, we're not going to ask the U.S. for anything. This is a unilateral program, and what the U.S. decides to give us, we will take. We will appreciate it. We both benefit from AGOA benefits. So we kind of evaded that problem. We had other challenges. As Dominique would remember, when the trade facilitation agreement first came out, the Africans, and I had no problem with it, was going to negotiate it. They have every right to negotiate it, saying, well, before we sign, how much money are we getting? What kind of special treatment is going to be there for us? For whatever reason, the U.S. took greater front, because trade facilitation is a very high priority for the U.S. government, not only because of Africa, but in the whole world and so on, because of export importance. And people like the Trade Commissioner, who you'll be fortunate to hear speak later on, Fatima Asil, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Kenya, Amina, quickly read the tea leaves and said, I'm sorry, we have to support trade facilitation. It's in our interest. It'd be nice to do a little negotiating. I'm from New York. I love negotiating. But we better indicate earlier on that we're going to accept trade facilitation as part. Ambassador Froman started the whole practice. And I don't know how many people go back 2 years. But Ambassador Froman, while he was 3 years, when he was still with the National Security Council, he said, we need a single government approach to Africa. We need to have a coordinated approach. And AGOA is important, but is part of the overall basket. And then he went up to the Hill on the eve before the AGOA forum and said, we must renew AGOA. We should get some improvements. He identified 4 or 5 areas, which I'll get to in a second, and so on. This must be done. And that happened. The areas that I identified, however, very few people realize, originally came out of a report from the African Union called AGOA 2.0, which the Wilson Center had their own seminar, and they kind of highlighted it and said, these are the areas we really have to think about enhancing or improving AGOA. So there was this kind of a relationship that kind of moves AGOA through and in a fairly positive light. The current heroes of AGOA are 4 staff people who are working in the Congress while we speak. While we are going through a period of great partisan division in the U.S., and you just pick up the newspaper, you read about it every day and so on, these 4 people have agreed that unless the majority and the minority who are on the Senate Finance Committee, Republican Democrats, the majority and the minority on the Ways and Means Committee, the Trade Committee, you must remember AGOA is a trade bill, unless we agree among ourselves on a bipartisan approach, we're not going to move ahead. And that has stayed in place for 4 months now, and I think the result we will see very, very quickly and so on, and when the bill comes up. And when the bill is tied to the Movement of Trade Promotion Authority, that's going to have a humpy job on it. Whether AGOA should be part of the Trade Promotion Authority bill or not is an open question. I don't think it will be, but that it moves in the same time frame. But the important thing, if TPA gets into problem, AGOA may have to move with other pieces of trade legislation. I'm feeling very good that AGOA will be renewed before June, certainly before summer recess, and we won't have the cliffhanger we had a couple of years ago. What can we do? I, myself, Manchester Trade, has been very much in favor of AGOA enhancements. Very difficult to get, and we all agree that politically, these 4 committee people have to agree what is possible. But the fact that AGOA pass is not the end of the process, is the beginning of the process. And it involves 5 things. Number 1, Africa must participate in assembly lines, in global value chains. That's its future. Agriculture, everybody says important, I won't argue. But global value chains is the secret of development. That's the secret of what the Far East did as far as how they go. We may have a special origin rule, I don't think so, but UNCTAD has just turned out an excellent report with Mr. Katui, another African, that kind of lays out the way to move ahead and so on. We must be flexible on our designation list. We cannot have a repeat of Madagascar, where a country which is thriving under AGOA has a bunch of questionable people violate democratic tradition, grab power, and so on. I don't want to get into the middle of Madagascar, but the people who are punished are the seamstresses in Madagascar who basically have their job fed in 30,000. I think there'll be flexibility on designation of what comes out, and hopefully that flexibility will enable the U.S., if there are people who abuse democracy, aberrant behavior, these people are targeted like we do with Russia, like we do with Southern Sudan. We just did the same thing in Venezuela and so on, but we should target people if there's an abuse of democracy and not necessarily punish the whole country and so on. Continental FTA, that is the future of the U.S. The U.S. needs the large markets in order to have its supply chains operate, in order to have its retailers, its distribution chains operate. It needs that. So we must support that. And to get to your question for a moment and so on. AGOA, by giving Africa anywhere, I predict 10 to 12 years, we will see, but giving Africa 10 to 12 years to get its house in order, sets up the possibility for a mega-type trade agreement with the U.S. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of people saying we must be in a position when AGOA is not to go through the divisiveness of the economic partnership agreement where the Europeans kind of cut you up like they did in the Treaty of Berlin and got this country and that country to sign, and eventually countries had to sign if they believed in regional integration, because you couldn't have a regional integration group with some countries signing, some countries not signing. So they had done that. But the beauty of it is that if AGOA works properly, we can move together. There's a great pressure, as you know, to add some agricultural products to AGOA, particularly groundnuts, which are growing throughout the hemisphere, particularly tobacco, which are growing in the MMTZ countries, Mozambique, Malawi, Tanzania, and Zambia, and so on. Even if they are not in the bill, there is still flexibility within the AGOA law, possibly, to have them designated. Not to have them designated to increase exports to the U.S., there are TRQs, but there are tariff rate quotas that are not being filled, and if Africa had the right to ship, they could fill them without exceeding the level the U.S. feels is acceptable, and so on. So there are these particular areas in place. The last one, which I always keep to the end, is I will not allow I will argue that the United States should not allow the European Union having forced agreements on Africa to prevent economic integration. And when we end up with that choice, which we will, between countries like Ethiopia, Congo, others that have not signed EPAs, getting ready to form the Continental Free Trade Agreement that we'll hear a lot about in a few moments and so on, we cannot have an EU duty reduction or an EU requirement that somebody maintains duties and somebody doesn't, and so on, prevent that. An agreement signed under coercion is not a forced agreement. You cannot enforce it. I don't know what will happen with the EU. My own hope is that the EU will show flexibility and will not have its individual requirements and so on in this agreement prevent economic integration. 2 recommendations based on my own time in Africa. Let me just conclude this way. The one thing I did notice, and I think it did create some of the problems we face today, is that in many African countries, they have 2 ministers of trade. One is concerned with regional integration, and the other minister is concerned with WTO, AGOA, third country matters. It doesn't work that way. The U.S. learned that. They put the United States Trade Representative in charge of all trade negotiations and so on. The European Union has a commission for trade. So that's the one model I would think you have to really review, because you can't have this differentiation between the 2 types of agreement that I am discussing. And the second issue, which I think is something that has to be looked at, is what model do you get to integration? You have the ECOWAS model, which I like better. There you
The
put
Economic
together-
Community for West African States.
Thank you so much. Where you put together at the same time a free trade agreement, which allows trade to flow between countries, and the common external tariff, which regulates imports into the customs union or into the area. And when you do the 2 together, you don't need those pesky origin rules, because the problem, if you're allowing trade to flow within a country, what do you do with a product that comes and it's a U.S. product? Do you allow that to flow or not? And you end up having to come up with really complicated trade-distorting origin rules. So the second suggestion I have is that even though the Continental Free Trade Agreement is moving along, and I think will finish closer to 2017 than many people suspect, and so on, but perhaps we agree to move right into, or as quickly thereafter, into a customs union. And remember, the Lagos Plan of Action, the Abuja Treaty, provides for a customs union to be effective in Africa in 2019. And if they're in effect, we get a go extended to 2025, 2027, like I hope, maybe 2030, 15 years. We then have enough time to negotiate as equals all of Africa, all of the U.S. So the answer to your question is that that's your linkage between the 2. Thank you very much.
I am surprised we got him to speak in this short time possible. But talking about time, I'm a little frustrated that people are coming late. It is, and Monday keeps talking about this all the time, it is frustrating that people come late. And I wanted to sincerely apologize that there are people in this room, you people have taken the time to actually be here on time. And this is beyond traffic. This is just late. And I'd like to apologize. If you could bear with us for a few more minutes, we'll get all the African Union people here. People are here in advance. And I just wanted to say that if there are any people that have specific questions, let's ask the questions right now, so that even if you have questions for the Honorable Mencha, Honorable Asil, the Commissioner of Trade, and the Chairperson, we will take them, and they will take them first. So if you have any specific questions, we'll take them right now, start the process of addressing them, so by the time everybody comes, we at least have the groundwork. So any specific questions? Yes. And please introduce yourself. Hey, Amy.
What you all have been talking about is very sort of inspirational, but also very aspirational in my view, because we've been hearing, and in fact we've been hearing increased talk particularly in many ECOWAS countries, about sort of really focusing on increasing self-sufficiency in food, and specifically in rice. And what this leads to is exactly the opposite of what you, Steve, talked about. It leads to not common tariffs. It doesn't lead to coordinated action. It does not lead to integrated regional trade. It results in competitive tariffing, illegal trade, a lot of cross-border shenanigans. And people and the messages about trade seem to be inconsistent with some of the messages that we're hearing about national ag priorities. So could you guys address that a little bit? Because reality seems to be running in a slightly opposite direction of aspiration at this point.
I'll actually have Dominic. Dominic, this is something that you're very familiar with. And if you could let Stephen bounce off. So we have Amy. Can we have another question, please? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Kwasi Bosompem with the Let's Go Africa Foundation.
Hi, Kwasi.
Don't you think these discussions about trade, AGOA, and other trade competitiveness with the U.S., from some of certain schools of thought, they are really very marginal to the central problem that is in Africa. That is much more the lack of real public-private financing mechanisms to improve infrastructure. I think some of us believe that that is the basic problems that lie in Africa. And you touched on it a little bit, talking about tomatoes, moving of goods from country to country. If you see what happened when Maputo corridor was opened between Johannesburg and Maputo, it opened up the whole region totally. Trade was facilitated, and so many other incentives were. There is something lacking, I mean, in terms of the energy, in terms of the drive in putting into place that kind of public-private mechanisms to improve infrastructure within the continent. If that thing is laid down and is implemented, what we are talking about and other processes will just follow.
You know what's interesting is that Kwasi and Amy almost have the same trade facilitation elements, and then of course something that Stephen talked about. I'll just take one more question. Sir in the back, can I get a microphone to the gentleman in the back?
Thank you very much. My name is Yaya Fanusi. I'm with the United States of Africa 2017 project. There's something you all are missing. If what you're talking about has to be successful, you have to have a centralized political authority to enforce what you're talking about. I'm not going to elaborate. I want you to think about it, because that's my area of specialization in development. I work with Latin America development and India. You need a centralized political authority to make sure whatever you're talking about works.
What's interesting is that if you read Agenda 2063, there's a very good publication out there. It talks about some of the 7 aspirative aspects, and I think that I will talk about that in a few minutes. Dominic, let's take Amy's question in the beginning, and before I do that, I'm very happy to be joined here by some of the people from the African Union. I'll be introducing the Commission in a few minutes, and at the front here are my friends Dr. Fareed Arthur and the Deputy Chief of Staff of Honorable Mencha, which means he's actually coming, the fact that these people are here. Again, I apologize that things have taken a while, but let's just take Amy's question, let's take Kwasi's question, and let's take, I'm sorry, I didn't get your name at the back, but we will take your question. I believe Ambassador Campbell from the Council on Foreign Relations is here. Ambassador, you're very welcome. I'll speak to you in a few minutes. Okay?
Yes, thank you. Yes, again, when I started, I said it's possible to say that we have heard this before. And I said, yes, that's possible. But what I'm saying really is that we are hearing it with the basics a bit different and in a better structure. Let me take West Africa. In fact, we have attending the spring meetings at the World Bank and IMF this week, the ECOWAS Commission attending, and some of the issues that the Commission is coming to discuss, coordinating with the relevant ministers from West Africa that are attending, is how do we move effectively to implement the common external tariff that really came into effect a week or so ago. The major impediment to trade in West Africa has been the difference between the tariff regime that was being followed by Nigeria and the rest of the region. Part of the negotiation of the common external tariff was to allow for the fifth band, which basically takes into account the concern of Nigeria. And then also the coordinating minister of economy of Nigeria issued a statement this week, basically confirming that the ECOWAS common external tariff now is the law in Nigeria. What we then really need to do, and that's part of what, although I don't represent the World Bank, I do work there, what we are really thinking that we should do, and the US and all the development partners should do, and I should really say that what I said earlier was applicable in Addis, is also applicable in Abuja.
Dominic, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just received a notification that we might actually keep this panel on for a few minutes and then let the Commissioner of Trade come in and start the process. However, I also want to make a note that I think that what you've done is effectively answered Amy's question, but also saying something to the effect that while we members of the diaspora, we members of the American audience, and we members outside Africa don't really have all the information and actually know that so much is happening on the continent. I mean, there are various sources of information, and it's easy for us not to actually have the faith. And Kwasi, this also goes to your question. I think that if you go to any of the African countries right now, if you go to Addis Ababa, go to Uganda, go to Kenya, go to Ghana, go to Nigeria, go to Togo, so much is happening in terms of trade facilitation at the level of the regional economic community. Sorry, what did you say? Okay. Is she here?
Yes, I saw her.
Okay, fine. Okay. At the end of the day, can I just have Stephen answer, almost respond to what Kasi was asking? If you can do this in 1 or 2 minutes so we can move to the next level.
So easy to work with you, Dennis. 2
You're
minutes,
welcome.
the history of Africa altogether. But thank you. But seriously, you have to begin someplace. The history of the world is that economic integration begins with trade. There's reasons for that. Trade doesn't involve a lot of money. You don't have to have expensive infrastructure projects. They're important. Trade is decisions that are normally made by the government. The government sets up your trade regime. It's in place already. And trade has a history of becoming an engine of growth, of offering markets opportunities, approaching investment. So no one ever says that trade is the only engine, is the only thing that matters. That's silly. But what we always say is that if you can get a good trade regime in place, in this case focusing on open markets within Africa and affluent third countries, you can move fairly quickly in other areas. They all must go together. And of course, the beauty of the regional communities is they begin focusing on things like the regional corridor. Your example of Mobutu is fine. First you have trade that you allow to flow, and then you have that. A quick final response to Amy. 2017, I always thank you. You put that date in place, the person in the back. You put that date in place 2017 before anybody talked about a continental free trade agreement, and I thank you for that. But Amy's reaction is, what you do with trade is you set up a framework. You set up a dispute settlement. You set up rules. So when people start with the import bans, people start with the special SPS regulations to slow agriculture, you then have an ability to go and say, I'm sorry, but that may not be consistent with our rules. Trade does not flow immediately after you put your free trade agreement in place. We'll see that with ECOWAS. But it sets up the basis, and one of the bases will be, and I will bet you money, if I'm around, you'll be around, but I will bet you money that by 2023, we're not talking anymore about country barriers, like you no longer talk about them in France. Remember when they started the European Union, you had the Italians pouring the French wine, always red wine, but it was bloody, in Rome, and you had the French pouring the Italian wine out. That doesn't happen now. What happens very little. Let me just stop because you have a time limit.
In 3 minutes and 13 seconds, you were able to get a really good answer out there. Let me just talk about something that I believe my friends Fareed Arthur from the African Union and Anthony will actually talk about or in private conversations afterwards. It is very important for us to not just remember that Africa is making really aggressive strides in terms of regional integration and in terms of growth. There are certain things that we, and Kwasi, in our generation, you and I, cannot necessarily say, oh yes, the days that have gone by are still the days that are existing today. We can never take away the fact that the young people are making and pushing for so much change. And interestingly, if you go back to what happened at the Obama summit last year, the African Union and the regional economic communities received so much. It was almost like de facto, de jure recognition. From that perspective, the African Union, the 8 regional economic communities, ECOWAS, East African Community, COMESA, SADC, these are really powerful institutions. We refer to their heads as Your Excellency. These have the requisite power. I just want to take 1 or 2 more questions so that we can actually prepare. Ma'am, in the back. I think you said a term, TPA, Trade Promotion Authority. We have to keep things as simple as possible. Stephen, Victoria is actually here to speak to the African Union from Political Pro. If you could address this issue, we could then move to the next question.
Virginia is one of the few press people who really follow AGOA closely, so I appreciate the question, and I honestly think you have the answer better than I do, but I will do my best to answer the question, and so on. The reason why they use the language in the same time frame as is because of the fact is the hope that if we have a bruising debate on Trade Promotion Authority, but the votes are there, and we'll see. There'll be enough Democrats, Republicans, cobble them together, and we'll get this through, I would think. Then people are not going to have a bunch of amendments to offer on AGOA. AGOA will be packaged with GSP. It may be packaged with other bills that have popularity. Customs Modernization Act. I'm not going to bore you with the details. There's a miscellaneous tariff bill, which NAM is still hoping can be included, which eliminates duties on product. This will form like an auxiliary, I think is the word, an ancillary package. And the hope is that in the aftermath of this bruising battle over TPA, AGOA will then pass as part of the other provisions. Somebody put it very well to me. They kept saying, you have to understand that when you're dealing with AGOA, that AGOA is the one issue that has bipartisan trade community support. It has always used TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, very important. We need it for Trans-Pacific Partnership. We need it for TTIP, the Trade and Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership with Europe. We really need it. But AGOA, but don't forget AGOA. And that is because, and this is really the accomplishment of the administration dating back to Bill Clinton and so on. And that is the fact that AGOA is just considered good and it has to pass. So I think the answer is, in answer to the question is, I don't think it will be on TPA from what I hear, but it could change, momentarily because 2-3 people decided. But I'm 95% sure that within a very short period of time, and I just put June up as my deadline and so on, they both will pass together and so on. And if TPA has something happens, I have a feeling there's enough pressure now to get AGOA through because of the excellent work of the ambassadors to point out the deadline and the need not to disrupt the apparel trade. So I think we're in good shape. The most important development actually is happening in the next 2 days because South Africa's in town, and for those who follow AGOA closely, I don't go into this detail, they have a poultry issue outstanding, a dumping issue It's something that normally would be dealt with in the World Trade Organization, but because of the timing and because you got 13 senators to sign a letter, 7 of whom are members of the Finance Committee, there's a lot of pressure for that issue to be resolved. And my own feeling is, no proof of course, is that we'll come up with some kind of a resolution to that issue. USTR is very good at cobbling together resolutions. No one will ever understand them, but they will always be able to cobble. They usually are able to cobble them together. So I think we'll end up with something positive, even in the South African poultry. And that will remove the last impediment to getting a longer-term extension of AGOA, which is important to many of us.
You know, I have a bit of, I've got very good news, and I have a little bad news. I don't know which one
Always
you
bad
want
news
first. Bad first.
Bad first. Always bad first.
So, due to circumstances beyond our control, High Excellency the Chairperson cannot join us. However, we have two very, if you use the word capable people, it looks as though, this is almost like a compensation. The group of people here are mostly interested in the trade and investment partnership between the United States and Africa. There is a very strong political element. Talking about Agenda 2063 is really, really key. And I know very well that some people will say, we would have liked to listen and hear from the chairperson talking about Agenda 2063. But if I was to break it down, and these are the documents that my friend Nadine brought, and these are outside, 2063 has 7 major aspirations. And ultimately, there are elements on peace and security. There are elements on good governance. There are elements on Africa being a more cohesive society in terms of culture. And for me and Dominic and for Stephen, there's a major component on economic development and another major component on trade and investment. From that perspective, I'd like to sincerely apologize that she cannot make it. However, we do have people who can speak to the issues you people care about in almost the same way. Monday? Okay, so I just wanted to say thank you so much for listening in. I'd like to introduce Monde Muyangwa, the director of the Africa program, and I wanted to thank you so much for being patient while we get our chief guests here. Thank you.
All right.
Dennis.
Thank you very much to our panelists for getting us to a really good start. Unfortunately, the chairperson's schedule is really busy and keeps evolving. And she has just been called into another meeting. And so where we are right now is that Congressman Royce is going to come. Many of you know him for his long engagement with the African continent, particularly on AGOA. And so he's going to come and he'll arrive here at 10:30. And he will be joined on the panel with the AU Commissioner for Trade and Industry. And so she will talk a little bit about Agenda 2063 and talk specifically honing in on the sort of relationship that they would like to see the United States play in the realization of Agenda 2063, but also look at what Africa is doing in the trade and investment and industry perspective of it. And then Congressman Royce will talk about how he sees US-Africa relations playing out, particularly in the trade and industry part of it, and then we can open it up for Q&A. And so with that, we'll take a quick break and we'll ask everybody to convene back here about 10:25 because we expect the session to start directly at 10:30. So thank you very much.